In the final decade of the 17th century, thousands of people in the Caribbean went to work in the wealthiest city in the West and ended the day as ghosts. On a Tuesday morning in June, the air was hot, heavy, and perfectly still. Merchants were meeting for mid-morning drinks to escape the humid glare of the sun. Ships were unloading heavy cargoes of tobacco, indigo, and raw silver. Church bells rang out to mark the hour, a sound that usually signaled a brief pause in the frantic, greedy pace of the most notorious port on the planet. Within minutes, less time than it takes to read a single page of history, the streets fell silent, the buildings vanished beneath the tide, and a single terrifying question echoed across the harbor. Was this the judgment of God? To understand the scale of what was lost, you have to understand the height from which this city fell. Port Royal was not merely a town. It was the beating heart of the Caribbean world, a fortified and incredibly wealthy engine of the Atlantic Empire. It was the crucial hinge connecting the silver mines of the Andes to the markets of London and Amsterdam. Inside its crowded brick walls lived the most diverse and dangerous collection of humanity ever assembled in the New World. Imagine arriving by ship at the height of its power in 1692. The harbor appears first, a dense, chaotic forest of masts and rigging stretching into the clouds, with over 200 ships visiting in a single year. You see the heavy black muzzles of cannons staring out from 5 massive stone forts, and flags from every major empire snapping in the salt air. But the smell reaches you before the shore does. It is a thick human scent, the brine of the sea mixed with the stinging sweetness of spilled rum, the acrid bite of wood smoke, and the human smell of nearly 10,000 bodies packed into just 51 acres of land. Port Royal lived off movement, sugar out, bullion in, and everything in between, carried by hands that knew how to turn risk into profit. Wealth here did not arrive slowly. It erupted. The streets were narrow and alive with motion, lined with brick buildings 3 or 4 stories high. This was unheard of in the Caribbean, where most structures were low and wooden to survive the heat. But Port Royal wanted to look like London. It had brick sidewalks, ornate wooden balconies, and rents as high as the finest districts in Cheapside. However, the wickedness of Port Royal was built on a foundation much darker than just rum and gambling. While the city was the commercial center of the West, it was also a major transit point for the transatlantic slave trade. Alongside the tobacco and silver sat a human cargo of thousands of enslaved Africans. By 1690, the population included approximately 2,500 enslaved people. This exploitation was the silent engine of the city's prosperity, with enslaved labor used in construction and loading the very docks that made the merchant class rich. The success of this economy was not found in the chaos of a pirate raid, but in the precision of the aftermath. This was the architecture of information. Behind the scenes, a merchant spine of Spanish, Portuguese, Sephardic Jews operated a private infrastructure of credit and intelligence. Because they were part of a diaspora spread across Amsterdam, London, and the Spanish Main, they had access to data no English official could find. They knew the exact day the Spanish silver train, vast convoys of mules hauling tons of bullion across the Panama jungle, was scheduled to depart. When a privateer returned with stolen Spanish cargo, these merchants provided the bridge to utility. They would repackage the loot, mark it with English labels, and issue new paperwork that made stolen goods look like legal products of Jamaica. They laundered the spoils of war into the currency of empires. But while these merchants were masters of the information that made the city rich, they had ignored the architecture of the earth itself. Port Royal sat on a geographical trap. The peninsula was essentially a 65-foot deep pile of loose, waterlogged grains of sand. The ground held firm only as long as it remained perfectly still. But the city was not just sitting on sand. It was perched directly on a geological trigger. Jamaica lies along the Anriquillo-Plantin Garden Fault Zone, a site of constant tectonic collision. As the city grew richer and the brick buildings grew heavier, the pressure on that saturated sand foundation became an inevitable countdown to a disaster written in the plates of the earth. On the morning of June 7, 1692, the rector of Port Royal had just finished reading prayers at St. Paul's Church to keep up some show of religion among a most ungodly people. He went to share a glass of wine with the president of the council, who delayed him by lighting a long pipe of tobacco. That delay saved the rector's life. Had he left for his original dinner appointment at Captain Rudin's house, he would have been lost. The house was among the first to be swallowed by the earth, taking the captain and his entire family with it. At 20 minutes to 12, the earth reached its breaking point. The first sign was not the shaking, but the sea itself. The trough of a massive tsunami struck land first, causing the harbor waters to recede and pull away from the wharves in an eerie, terrifying silence. Then the earth trembled. At first, people laughed nervously. Earthquakes were usually just a brief shudder. But this time, the shaking didn't stop. It grew into a violent, rhythmic roar. 3 shocks were felt in rapid succession. The heavy brick towers of the churches began to sway, their bells ringing wildly, as if screaming a warning before crashing into the streets. In a terrifying process called liquefaction, the sand beneath the city turned to liquid. The ground literally gave way. Some buildings didn't fall, they simply slid, perfectly upright, into the harbor. Others tilted and sank floor by floor, as if being swallowed by a giant mouth. People ran for their lives, but the ground opened up beneath them. Witnesses described seeing their neighbors swallowed up to the neck before the earth shut upon them, squeezing them to death. Heads were left poking out of the cobblestones, buried alive in the middle of what had been a busy street just seconds before. The receding sea then returned as a massive, crushing wave. The sound was a nightmare of wood snapping and the collective scream of thousands. A large warship, the HMS Swan, which was being careened for repairs and had no ballast, was lifted by the tsunami and tossed from the harbor into the middle of town, where it crashed through the roof of a house. In the time it takes to boil a pot of water, 2/3 of the city was gone. The taverns that were full of laughter minutes ago were now dark tombs beneath the tide. When the shaking finally stopped, the richest city in the West had become an empty horizon. 2,000 people died instantly. Another 3,000 would perish in the weeks that followed from disease. But as the sun set over the ruins, the wickedness didn't stop. That very same night, companies of looters fell to breaking open deserted warehouses to rob their neighbors, even as houses fell on them in the act. To the 17th century mind, this was direct divine chastisement. Port Royal was labeled a mere Sodom and a sink of all filthiness. For decades after the disaster, the ruins of Port Royal remained a haunting presence. On calm days, sailors reported seeing the rooftops and the chimneys of the ghost city resting just beneath the clear water, now habitations for fish. These sunken streets remained visible for years, a literal graveyard of the 17th century that stayed just out of reach. The earthquake didn't just kill people. It killed the legal infrastructure of the Caribbean. The architecture of information, the corrupt governors, the fences, and the detailed merchant ledgers was erased. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 had already begun the move toward legitimate naval power, and the earthquake was the final nail in the coffin for state-sanctioned buccaneering. Without the infrastructure of Port Royal to launder their loot, a privateer was now just a pirate. The city transformed from a safe haven for rovers into a place of execution. Gallows Point became a landmark of this shift, where notorious pirates like Charles Vane and Calico Jack Rackham were eventually hanged. The survivors in the merchant class realized that the sand spit was no longer a safe foundation. This triggered a massive shift to the stable mainland, leading to the rapid establishment of Kingston. The international credit lines and diaspora networks that had made Port Royal thrive didn't vanish. They simply migrated, making Kingston the new commercial heart of Jamaica. By 1703, laws were passed, making Kingston the chief center of trade. Kingston's success was the direct legacy of Port Royal's refugees. The legend of Port Royal didn't just stay in history. It bled into global literature and later Caribbean identity. The real-life experiences of privateers like Alexander Selkirk served as a direct inspiration for the character of Ben Gunn in Treasure Island and the legendary Robinson Crusoe. The city became a mythic cautionary tale, a sunken Sodom that lived on in seafaring folklore. It was only when modern technology allowed us to see through the silt that we realized the stories were true. Port Royal is a catastrophic sight, frozen like a photograph captures an image. Because the city sank so quickly and vertically, it preserved life at a precise moment in time. When archaeologists dive there today, they find a city interrupted mid-sentence. They find plates still sitting on tables and bottles of wine still sealed with their corks. They find thousands of white clay pipes and even a pocket watch with its hands frozen forever at 11:43. Today, the wickedest city on earth is a quiet fishing village of 1,800 people. But the inhabitants view themselves uniquely. They are not just Jamaicans, they are Port Royalists, a title that carries the weight of a legendary heritage. The fish swim through the windows where candles once burned, and Port Royal reminds us of a truth that history repeats again and again. We think our greatest threats come from the outside, from wars, from enemies, or from things we can see coming. But sometimes the greatest destruction is the one waiting quietly beneath our feet. The city that ruled the Caribbean didn't fall to an invading fleet. It fell to the ground itself. Beneath that calm water lies a single moment preserved forever, a moment when humanity believed it had conquered the new world just seconds before the earth decided otherwise. Anyways, I'm Miles, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.